Good afternoon, everybody. So thank you for bearing with me. I know I'm the last speaker before lunch, so I'm going to talk to you today about a research project that is part of our broader research programme with the Environmental Protection Agency. So at the ESRI, and many of you are familiar with us, we do policy-relevant applied research for a number of different government departments and state agencies, and the EPA is one of our major stakeholders, and we work very closely with them. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about a piece of research where we're trying to look at the extent to which, I suppose, the locations in which we spend our time influence our ambient air pollution exposures and concentrations. So I suppose I'm not going to repeat what's already been spoken about this morning in terms of the harmful effects of air pollution. I think, as Nina said, the evidence is really, really clear. It's been accumulating over time in terms of multiple sort of effects across multiple organ systems in the body. And this is reflected, obviously, in stricter and stricter guidelines and now EU legislation. And often when we do studies of the impact of air pollution on health outcomes, we sort of look at where people live and we take their residential or their home exposure or concentrations as a kind of a reasonable proxy for the exposure that they're getting in general. And this can be problematic when you're looking at sort of longer term associations between pollutants and health outcomes. And there's quite a big sort of discussion around how we measure sort of more personal exposure. And obviously that's influenced by a very complex set of factors, one of which is the sort of different activities and locations in which we spend our time. So none of us here sitting in this room today are at home, but often when we do these studies, we're looking at our exposure at home. It was mentioned earlier as well, obviously, the importance of indoor air, but I'm not going to be dealing with that in this study. So what I'm going to be looking at essentially is one of the major locations where we spend a lot of our time away from home, which is our work location. And then for students, it's their school or their college. We know from other studies that that's sort of the next largest location where we spend most of our time. As I mentioned, there's a large literature that's looking at personal exposure and trying to measure this. And one of our earlier speakers talked about, I think Nina talked about people wearing backpacks and school children wearing backpacks to try and get at their personal exposure and how that might vary across the day. But there's been some really nice studies that have looked at the impact of, I suppose, where we spend our time and the types of activities we do and how that can influence the air pollution that we're exposed to. So there was an EPA-funded study a number of years ago that looked at Dublin office workers, and they looked specifically at PM10. And they found, as you probably would expect for people commuting into Dublin city centre, that their concentrations that they were exposed to at work were significantly greater than those that they were exposed to on average across a 24-hour period. Similar research then in London and also in Belgium. And interestingly, and I'll come back to this later, the actual commuting journey itself can be quite a location in which people are exposed to quite high levels of pollution, particularly those, for example, commuting on the London Underground. So what we do in this study is we link two different sources of data. So first of all, we need to know where people live and where they're working and where they go to school or college. And we have really excellent data on this from the Census of Population. So if you remember back to the last census and filling out your household form and your individual form, for those of us that are working, we were asked to record where our workplace was. And if you had children or college students, they similarly, those had to be recorded as well. So this was the advantage of this is that we have the sort of the full population of workers and students. We exclude people that are working from home because obviously their location of work is the same as their home location. So we've about 1.5 million workers and just over 1 million students at both or at primary, secondary and third level education. And we match these, or we link these data then to data from the EPA Life Emerald project. And I'd like to specifically thank Dahi, who worked really closely with us in providing us with the high resolution air quality maps. So we have data from those maps for 2022 to align with the census for these sort of 4 key air pollutants: PM2.5, 10, ozone, and NO2. And we linked these data to the home, work, school and college locations at the census small area level. So not exactly at the locations, but at these very sort of small resolution census small area levels. And there's over 18,000 of them across the country. So this is what the data look like when we use it for our worker and student samples all together. So these are the sort of maps that you're familiar with when you look at the air quality website. So first of all, we looked at what were the average concentrations like for both the group of workers in the census and the group of students, so aggregating people at primary, secondary and third level. What I've put across the top then, in the top 2 rows, are the sort of the EU, the current EU air quality limits, which obviously, as we know from this morning's talk from Owen, are being sort of successively moving towards the WHO guidelines. So if you look, for example, at PM2.5 for the group of workers, you can see there that on average people are exposed to slightly more PM2.5 at work than they are at home. And that's pretty much true for all of the pollutants except for ozone, where the relationship is kind of inverse. And that's kind of, as you see when you look at the maps, you know, the ozone concentrations are higher sort of in rural areas and more least densely populated areas. I suppose the one pollutant that really stands out in terms of that contrast between home and work or home and school locations is NO2. And this is a constant theme then throughout the rest of the presentation. It's obviously a much more localised pollutant. So you see the greatest contrast between home and work or school or college locations for NO2. But obviously the mean only tells you so much, and there's obviously a full distribution in terms of people's concentrations at home and work and school and college underlying this. So there's obviously a lot of detail on these slides and it's quite small to look at. So really just sort of get a sense of the full distribution. The blue lines are the residential or the home concentrations, and the red then are those at work. So this is for the population of workers. And really, again, I'll sort of draw your attention to the NO2 findings here, where you can see that really long right tail in relation to NO2. So there are some people who are exposed to, you know, very high levels, both at home and at work. But on average, the exposures or the concentrations at work locations are higher than those at home. I'm not showing you all of the graphs for the students, but these are disaggregated by whether people are in primary school, second level, and then third level. And this is just for PM2.5. We've obviously looked at it for the other pollutants as well. But as you can see, I think the interesting one really is the third level students. And I suppose this reflects, the concentration of third level institutions in certain areas. So it's very much a sort of a multimodal distribution in terms of people's concentrations that they experience in third level or college locations. Another way of looking at these kind of contrasts then is to calculate for each individual in the census this what we call a concentration ratio. So this is the ratio of their concentration that's measured at their work location or their school or college location to their home location. And you can see here, so for example, this is sort of expressed as a heat map. Again, the contrasts for NO2 are much stronger than they are for the other pollutants. So for example, for people in the overall worker sample, it's about 47% higher at their work location than it is at their home location. And I suppose the advantage of the census data is that we can look at how that varies across different groups of workers. So The NFQ are people disaggregated by their level of education. So those 7 to 10 are people who have degree level or higher. And that contrast is slightly higher for them than it is for people with relatively lower levels of education. But really what drives these kind of contrasts is commuting patterns, as you would expect. So people commuting from rural areas into urban areas have the highest contrasts, as you would expect. I think there's nothing surprising there. But it's about, it's over twice in terms of their NO2 concentrations. For students then, we can look at a similar exercise in terms of their concentration ratios. And again, quite similar results in terms of the commuting patterns, where NO2 is really where the contrasts are higher, and that rural to urban pattern really comes out as quite strong in terms of the contrast. And really the interesting thing, I think, as well is related to the level of education here. So you can see for primary students, that contrast is much less in terms of all of the pollutants, and also for NO2, it's only about 7% higher for students in primary school at their school location. But I suppose when you think about the network of national schools across the country and the distance that younger children travel to school, they're much more likely to be much closer to their home location. So that contrast is a lot less. The final bit of work that we did in this project then was to say, well, okay, most of the time when we do these sort of studies of longer term impacts of air pollution on health outcomes, we proxy air pollution exposure at your home address. But if we were to take into account the fact that people spend some time at work, they spend some time at school or college, that's just one location that people spend their time. But if we just took that into account, what difference does that make to measures of these concentrations that people are exposed to? And what we found was that for workers, so for people that are commuting to work, their residential or their home concentrations were on average about 8% lower than their sort of location adjusted concentrations for NO2, and pretty similar for the other pollutants. And then for students, those that were attending third level, that contrast or that sort of underestimation of their concentration levels was over 10%, was about 11%. So to summarise then, we used, in this project, we used linked Census and EPA Life Emerald data to show that distinction between ambient air pollution concentrations at home and work, school and college locations. And we found that these concentrations differed across pollutants. I sort of drew your attention there to the findings, and in particular for NO2. They also, and I didn't bring this out too much in the presentation, but they differed as well by socioeconomic position. So in general, those that were in more advantaged situations had higher contrasts. Now, that's obviously due to the fact that they may be commuting into city centre areas, but it's also a function of the fact that they may be living, and we know this, they're living in areas that have lower concentrations of these pollutants. And importantly then, it was obviously driven by this spatial pattern of commuting, so what people's combinations were. And in particular for NO2, simply relying on ambient measures at people's home address will be underestimating their average concentrations. And ideally, we'd like to incorporate sort of further activity and location information to further refine these measurements of what people are actually exposed to. But we have very little data in Ireland on how people spend their time. The last nationally representative time use survey in Ireland was actually over 20 years ago, and people's lives have changed massively in that time. There has been some work that's been done using EPA-funded research by Brian Broderick, which looked at double office workers, and we get some sense from that. But there is, I suppose, an interesting further piece of work that might be interesting when it comes out, which is an EPA-funded project on what's called station air. I don't know whether somebody in the audience is involved in it, which is looking at people's exposure in sort of mainline train stations when obviously diesel locomotives are going through. And that's quite consistent then with some of the international research around the actual commuting journey. And one thing that we found actually, sorry, I'm a little bit over time, was that people who commuted by Dart, Rail and Lewis had that highest contrast in their home and work locations. So I'll finish up there, obviously, with the policy context and mention also, I suppose, complementary measures in terms of indoor air quality and the recent Health and Safety Authority Code of Practice for Indoor Air Quality. And finally, thanks to the EPA for the data and to CSO who provided us with access to the Census microfile on place of work.